Welcome to the show today. My name is Douglas Gabriel. I'm here with my good friend and editor, John Barnwell, also an author. We're going to discuss today a very controversial title that if you see this book, which is now out on Amazon, called Rudolf Steiner and the Masters, it may make you, if you're an anthroposophist, twinge a bit. And if you're not, you'll say, Rudolf Steiner's a master? And then you might get upset. I intend that by the end of these two talks that we will have clarified many issues which are points of great contention in anthroposophy and theosophy concerning the masters. There is so much confusion around this topic that it will take John and I, quite a while to dissemble this. Now, in the old days, someone comes in the Mayflower, John, they say, I want a book about the masters. How many books would you have to give them?
Yeah, that was really quite a hot topic back in the 70s. It really kind of, after 1975, really, was when things really started approaching that subject from all different camps, from all different groups of people were trying to figure out what they're referring to. And if you get into the topics that are covered in this book, this is a pretty narrow scope in this book on that subject on a certain level, and on another level it gives quite a broad view because it gives you the general context, but yet it specifically points towards certain individual beings that Rudolf Steiner at times would refer to as the master of wisdom and the harmonization of sensations and feelings. And one way one could look at this subject is, well, what are masters? Well, they're beings that are in the present time manifesting future states of consciousness that mankind will eventually attain to if they follow the intentions of the divine spiritual beings.
An excellent introduction. Precisely, we have to define the terms. So in those days, someone comes in and says, I want a book on the masters, which in fact, Kathleen Kennedy asked us about repeatedly. And some of those things turned into the content of course, with Marcel Lucas, Star Wars, and with Indiana Jones, Kathleen Kennedy. So what did we try to tell them? First off, one of the sets that people would come in and ask most for was David Spalding's set, The Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. Complete poppycock. Okay, it's got great wisdom in it. As Steiner says, there's 12 masters of wisdom and of the harmonization of feelings and sensations who live basically in the realm of Shambhala, and they come out of Shambhala down to us and go back into Shambhala. And there are avatars who descend, and there are the masters or the bodhicitas or the bodhisattvas who ascend. And then there's also the master beings who are in the Tibetan tradition and Buddhist tradition called tulkus, which Steiner calls being overlighted by a variety of beings. As a matter of fact, when you read this book, you will say, I had no idea we have so much spiritual help standing right there at the threshold at every moment to help us. And so you can call them the communion of saints. You can call them yidams. You can call them yoginis. You can call them mahatmas or geshes or lamas. But in certain traditions, like with the traditions that I have studied quite thoroughly, you can't study it thoroughly, that I've studied quite a lot. When you meet a high lama, well, they're like a PhD in philosophy, okay? So what do we do in the West? We still use the old guild system, apprentice, master, journeyman. So when you want to find a master, in the old days, as John made reference to there, when people would come into the Mayflower, they wanted a master. They wanted their own master. Your master wasn't good enough for them. They didn't want, the Kundalini master. They didn't want the Hatha Yoga master. They didn't want the Agni Yoga master. They didn't want, and then all the crazy masters, all the crazy cults that started. But what do these all point to? They point to the fact that as a human being, your soul is encumbered with the challenge to make your soul become pure enough that it can join with your spirit. And as John pointed out, master beings are beings who are already developing future capacities. They have them in themselves now. Why? Because they're not bound by time and space. They use consciousness to transcend time and space. So if you could do that, you could meet your master inside of you. It could be the being of wisdom speaking to you. It could be your guardian angel. It could be anything that you envision is the higher spiritual aspects of yourself, which could be called truth, beauty, and goodness, could be called a variety of things. But Steiner calls it wisdom, of course. So when you merge with your higher self, one could call it literally very similar to your guardian angel. If you could merge with your higher self, your guardian angel, you would basically be no longer bound by this physical realm. And is that not what people are really saying when they come in and they say, I need a master to put me on the path? I get asked this all the time. Will I take someone on as a student, or do I do these things, for other people, and blah, 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 blah. And certainly I won't, because I'm not a guru, and I believe in the Steiner path. But the Steiner path is very confusing. Holy moly. If you mention the masters in my days, and by the way, I got a bachelor degree in anthroposophical studies and a master's degree in Waldorf education. And in those days, I studied here in America with some of the greatest anthroposophists worldwide who would come here and teach. And so essentially, what is really going on there? You're training to do what in anthroposophy? You're training to enter into higher worlds. You're training to enter into what they would say, the Tibetan Buddhists would call a tulku, a being who becomes a vessel for a higher stream of consciousness. Now, in different traditions, this same being of wisdom, let's focus on the being of wisdom, the master of wisdom. Well, that's in Tibetan Buddhism, and Buddhism, the Maitreya Buddha. I have met 4 tulkus of the Maitreya Buddha in my lifetime. Okay? I knew them well. One of them, I was the principal of the school, and I brought him over from Maui to the Big Island, and I basically sheltered this child. But there were many of these beings, the Nechung Rinpoche, or I met the tulku of Vajrayogini, or who are these? Are these higher beings? Would it be good for me to give my ego over to one of these beings and say, now you decide for me what I'm supposed to do. You give me the magic Kundalini word, or the magic mantra word to meditate on, or you give me, the ultimate mantra, the 100-syllable mantra. And so when it came to Steiner was having to stand in between the Eastern masters and the traditions of the masters out of the East, which also include avatars, masters, and tulkus, and 1,000 different names for these beings who are on the other side of this threshold of the spiritual world. But Steiner himself at first worked in the Theosophical Society. And when he did, he was asked to illuminate the teachings that came from the Master El Morya, or the Master Kutumi, or the Theosophic Master Jesus, or the Theosophic Master, we call him Saint Germain probably. Or in the modern world, I've told you these stories before, I sat with Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who literally went through like one of those music machines you used to punch in the numbers to get a song at a restaurant.
A jukebox.
A jukebox. She was a jukebox for the masters. It didn't matter who you wanted to talk to. She could channel them right there and then. And she was trying to impress me. So she was channeling Mother Mary, and she was channeling Jesus, and and then at one point she went into a really deep state where the Master Saint Germain told her that if I would marry her and move there to her crazy place out there in the West, and be that the Master Saint Germain would pronounce that I am the universal and one channel of Saint Germain. Okay, you know how many Saint Germains I've met, John? How many books are inspired by Saint Germain that you used to sell at the Mayflower. I started making a list one day, and it was up at, I was into 24, Godfrey Ray King, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, David Spalding, A.P. Sinnott, Annie Besant. I mean, come on. You could go on with 100 names of people who say they channeled the masters, and guess what? They were slightly in touch probably with their higher self. That's it. Ramtha. Did you think Ramtha was real? Did you think these masters from Lemuria were real? Or did you actually see straight through that and see that everyone has a master in them? Rudolf Steiner defines it as such. Now, I'm going to go back and I'm going to read something from the early days, which should upset some anthroposophists, because many anthroposophists don't want to look at the theosophical esoteric teachings of Rudolf Steiner from 1903 to 1906. Because he says things differently. He speaks in theosophical language, and he says that these beings speak through him, or that he speaks for them. Sorry, it's in the book, if you don't believe me, and I will read one passage for that. But this is what he says. Higher wisdom is simply the emanation of more highly developed spiritual individualities, including your individuality. So in other words, every time you're tapping into wisdom, you are probably tapping into a spiritual being who lives in the realm that he calls the realm of spiritual economy, or he calls it the super etheric realm, or the etheric realm around the earth, or he literally calls it Shambhala. And so every time you want to tap into the being of Anthroposophia, or the being Sophia of wisdom, you are in fact using your own higher capacities, your own inner master, and the master of this case wisdom, that would be feeling, so moral imagination, or the master of moral inspiration in your feelings, or the master of intuition in your willing. So as you become the masters that you're supposed to become, then these examples that we have of people who say they are great masters from ancient lineages, ancient traditions, ancient Eastern traditions, Western traditions, Caucasian traditions from the Caucasian mountains, or all these people that we could list, and the list is huge. You are those beings, and Rudolf Steiner was able to tap into all of them. But if you try to, like so many people have recently done, some of them, literally leaders of the Anthroposophic Society, calling Rudolf Steiner the Master Seraphim. Serapis, Serapis, unbelievable. Or that, somebody says they're channeling Dwal Kul again, like Alice Bailey did, or somebody says that they, met Kuthumi in England. Or how about Benjamin Krim, who said that he knew the Maitreya Buddha, and he went everywhere for years preaching that he was going to reveal the Maitreya Buddha. And then he said he was the Maitreya Buddha. And then he found some guy who was 8 feet tall in India, and he was walking around with him for a while saying he was the Maitreya Buddha. So what I'm saying is, beware. You must be wise as a, gentle as a dove and wise as a serpent, if you were to handle the question of what is a master being.
Yeah, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And so, when you're confronted with a daunting subject such as this, you have to be very, very circumspect. And I'm at times hesitant to talk about the subject because people are very, very sensitive regarding their particular path and the beings that they revere and the guru worship and all of that kind of things. And I've met a lot of those gurus. I mean, I have a film canister upstairs. It has white rice that was blessed by the Maitreya Buddha, the one you met, the one that lives in Hawaii. Les Collins gave it to me. And so and a lot of these beings that you meet, they're remarkable. But I think what you have to keep in mind is that these master beings, I believe they exist. Now, you may think that I'm hallucinating or dreaming, and that's okay. I don't mind. But I believe that there are individuals that are advanced human beings, and then there are other beings that allow higher beings that work through them. so that it's a complicated thing. And then you get into the idea of what Rudolf Steiner says regarding spiritual economy, that you could have an individual, you could be an individual that has a transformed etheric body that belonged to some great being in the past, and through the principles of spiritual economy, there was a replica made of it, and it was merged with your etheric body, or is the etheric body you're working through, or is overlighting your etheric body. And then you can go through the astral body, same kind of formulations. And also the ego, you could have a ego that is a replica of the ego of Christ Jesus. So it's very, very difficult to speak on this subject with any degree of clarity. And I remember when I met Benjamin Crumb. It was after he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times announcing that he was bringing forward the Maitreya Buddha. You know, a full-page ad in the New York Times. Do you know how much that cost? And I met Benjamin Crumb, and I have to tell you that there was this tremendous kind of force field that surrounded him, but yet that pushed me back. I didn't feel drawn to it. I felt uncomfortable. And so, I mean, what do you do with that? And I've met a lot of other different types of channeled beings. You know, we were the one-stop shopping network for the country back in the day, and all these people would pass through our doors, and I would meet all manner of gurus and saints and yogis and yoginis and tulkus, and it's all wonderful. And basically what I guess I could contribute to this is just beware of Maya, beware of the illusion, because the real thing is really real, but it's very, very difficult to get one to the point to where one is really essentially worthy to be able to come under the direct tutelage of one of the masters, and to be what's known in the East as a chela, which is a direct pupil of a master. And then you have within the traditions in the West, you have that whole saga of Lohengrin, the son of Parsifal, that he was a representative of the White Lodge. You know, and you have the Knights of the Round Table, the 12 Knights of the Round Table that represent the 12 aspects. And Rudolf Steiner describes how in the ancient European mysteries that they would have a 12-fold grouping, and then a 13th would be amongst them, and they would represent that higher aspect to it. And Goethe, of course, describes this in his poem, The Mysteries, because he knew all these things. Of course, like Rudolf Steiner, with his wonderful sense of humor, well, you know, those other people, well, they like to refer to the Goethe that they understand.
This key factor, even in Egyptian initiation, 12 hierophants standing around the initiate in the sepulcher, who basically transcends the physical world and goes into the spiritual world. So this is an ancient tradition, but it's this tradition of Hercules. What is Hercules? Who is Heracles? Who is Psyche? They're the hero, the heroine who stands upright, looks around, sees the celestial stars and sees the zodiac, and makes the effort to conquer each of the zodiacal signs and embody them and become what they are, both the negative and positive. And so those are the 12 labors of Hercules. Each of us must accomplish those labors. No master is going to accomplish those labors for you. Each initiate must go through the challenges of earth, water, air, and fire. No master being is going to accompany you on that path. Even if you go into a masonry, there's the worshipful master, and you go through all this morality training and these different levels of basically having symbols represent spiritual development of virtuous embodiment and moral development. And so in all these different paths, it all leads to the same place. But now we must remember there are no valid lineages. There are no more valid spiritual lineages. What we have now is the necessity to directly experience the spirit ourselves out of our own personal efforts without going into trance. Now, you can go into these realms each night. I often give this challenge to people. Try to stay awake for 3 nights. Don't do this, by the way. But if you think you're an initiate, try to stay awake for 3 nights. See what happens. Watch the images that then take over your ability to perceive and witness perception. That is the mobile world of the angels. That's the realm of thinking. And it's there for everyone. And so you can go into it through dream. You can go into it through a vision, through meditation, through initiation, or through death. And as you go into these realms, it isn't that you can go into the realms. That's the analogy I get is people want the master to grab them, take them to the threshold, and kick them across. Yeah, because they don't want to do the effort. They don't want to look at their own double. They don't want to look at taming their own astral body. But once you get into the spiritual world, the question is not that how did you get there even, or that you're there, or that it does exist. No, that's not the question. The question is, what are you going to do with the communications that happened in that realm when you come back into the physical realm? And that's what I try to tell people all the time. You don't need a lineage. Now, how many lineages have I gotten involved in? More than I can count, because I was studying them as a comparative religion. Actually, I was a PhD student and got a degree in comparative religion. So I was studying all these religions to look for the golden thread that goes through all of them. Now, in the old days, the golden thread was the master. It was the guru. It was the teacher. It was the priest king. It was, unfortunately, in the old days, was the priestess, and then it was subsumed by modern priests. And so if you look, you'll see that most modern religions are male-dominated religions, go back beyond 2000 BC, and they're female matrilineal traditions. So you have to say to yourself, where do you stand in all of this? If I was to introduce you to the highest tantric yoga teaching called Vajrayogini, and said, here is Jetsun Kushala, my friend. And she is the tulku of the Vajrayogini, who is the consort of all 10,000 Buddhas. Would it do you any good? Would it impress you? Well, let's say that, like myself, you studied the tradition for many years, and you've stayed true to the practice, and you've received the initiation and the retreat and the entire thing, all 13 yogas. Does it really matter that I met that person? Does it matter that I met the person who held the lineage tradition for that? I don't think it mattered at all. I think that a janitor that I might meet in some random bathroom somewhere cleaning the floor could be just as wise as any of these ancient lineage holders. So when it comes to Theosophy, the break that Steiner had with Theosophy was partially over the issue of J. Krishnamurti being called the reincarnation of Christ. In other words, the Master Jesus, who the Theosophists called the Master Jesus. And so some Theosophists, who I would call spurious Theosophists, claimed that J. Krishnamurti was this being. Well, Krishnamurti later said he was not that being and denied all of that. And so really, what good does it do to have an incarnated master being? First off, an avatar, Christ is an avatar, only incarnates once. Avatars can incarnate more than once, but in this case, this being is a being of the Holy Trinity, literally one of the 3 aspects of God. So that avatar would be quite different from an avatar like the being that overlighted Mary, the one called the Mother of Jesus, because that avatar was a combined set of beings from the realm of the Kyrioteites. Well, that's a very high rank of wisdom beings who then came down, not into the realm of the human, but into the realm of the angel and overlighted Mother Mary, causing her to become Mary Sophia. So you have 1,000 different descriptions of these beings. And when you go into ancient Vedanta and Vedic and the teachings of the East, basically you're going to get so many complicated teachings about the Kalki avatar, teachings about Kuan Yin, about the bodhicitta, about the vow of the bodhicitta, the vow also of the bodhisattva, and how a bodhisattva, a human being, developing into a master being, develops from a bodhisattva into a Buddha. And then what's the difference between a Buddha and a cultural leader like ancient Manu, who was the cultural leader of ancient India, or the ancient leader of Zarathustra, who's the leader of the Persian Zoroastrians. Or if you talk about Hermes, the great priest initiate of Egypt, who are these beings and where do they fit into the ranks? Well, the problem is the following. Theosophists had a tradition where they all wanted to say they physically met the master, a master. A master came into their room. A master gave them a spirit drawing of themselves. A master inspired them by answering questions like A.P. Sinnett in Esoteric Buddhism, that Alice Bailey was in direct communication with Dwal Kul, on and on and on and on until literally over 100 different series of books. And almost, you'd call them religions, but cults, like the cult of the I Am cult. Great people, lovely people. They're at their point on, but do they really understand who the Comte de Saint Germain is, or who Godfrey Ray King really was, or any of that? No, they don't. And so there are feeling ways to approach wisdom, and then there's devotional ways to approach wisdom through your willpower. But if one really wants to have a cosmological understanding of how human beings evolve into master beings, into higher hierarchies, then it's really good to stick with Rudolf Steiner. But Rudolf Steiner himself went through an evolution. For instance, I'm going to now read from 1906 what he says about the masters, that he had to intimately teach the content of other theosophists who said that they were in contact with these beings, and or that they were in contact with the wisdom stream of these beings, okay? So when Rudolf Steiner says these things, and mind you, I put, I don't know, maybe way too many, but many, many, many quotes of Rudolf Steiner talking about these masters. This is from an address in Berlin, June 26, 1906. He says, "The 12 masters of the White Lodge have all taken part in the whole Earth evolution. Masters involved in post-Atlantean development include Kuthumi, who helped effect the transition between the third, Egyptian Sumerian, and the fourth cultural periods. The Master Hilarion, inspirer of the fourth Greek Semitic cultural period. Jesus of Nazareth, who guided the transition between the fourth and fifth cultural periods. Christian Rosenkreuz, inspirer of the fifth Celtic Anglo-Germanic cultural period, and Moria, inspirer of the sixth or Slavic cultural period." And then he gives us this indication right afterwards. It says, "The Master Jesus and the Master Christian Rosenkreuz, who is also called Saint Germain, have prepared two paths of initiation for us, Christian esoteric path and the Christian Rosicrucian path." So the Christian esoteric path, the Christian Rosicrucian path were the Western paths that Rudolf Steiner taught from who the Theosophists called the Master Jesus, who is quite distinct from the Avatar Christ, by the way, and Christian Rosenkreuz, who is also who the Theosophists later called Saint Germain. But Rudolf Steiner goes back into great detail and explains who the Master Jesus is, because there is a Master Jesus, but it is so complicated, folks, that is the reason that we have put out these books, so that you can understand what Steiner is saying. Once you understand what he's saying, it is so logical, it is so self-evident that you come to say to yourself, well, I find nothing contrary to that. So the Master Jesus is not who the Summit Lighthouse, the Church Universal and Divine, or any of those groups calls Master Jesus. They want to say that Master Jesus was Christ. Well, that's not true. Or they would say that Christian Rosenkreuz, Steiner will refer to Saint Germain as Christian Rosenkreuz, even though the Theosophists do not refer to necessarily, in some cases they do, but they don't necessarily say that Saint Germain is Christian Rosenkreuz. So if you want to study the Western esoteric path of the teachings of the masters of wisdom and of the harmonization of feelings and sensations, the most sound foundation you can build upon is Rudolf Steiner, because he encompasses it all, just like that passage I just read. He tells who these masters were, when they worked, and basically he calls them the manus of a cultural period. And so the manus of the cultural period are humans at this point who are evolving into higher beings. Well, those are the beings that are our idols. They should be our heroes. They should be the ones we emulate. And there are many women too, by the way, in this tradition. I just haven't mentioned the Steiner quote that goes into that. But the being of Anthroposophia, he said, was the inspiration for all of Anthroposophy. He also said Christian Rosenkreuz, Saint Germain was one of the major inspirations for Anthroposophy. So Rudolf Steiner is a conglomeration. No, he is a synthesis of all of this wisdom. But the problem is when, and I can name the names and I can name the books, and I'm not going to, because that would just mislead you. You might go read those books and say, oh, so-and-so said that Steiner was Abraham. So-and-so said Steiner was the Maitreya Buddha. So-and-so said Steiner was the Kalki Avatar. So-and-so said Steiner was the Master G. No, Steiner clearly said who he was. But he said it in a number of lecture series, the world history and occult history, and a few other books. He makes reference to his incarnations and who was with him in these incarnations. And as you know, if you read Karmic Relationships, Steiner gives more information about previous incarnations than I think anyone except the very imaginative, fantasizing Theosophists. And so what he gives you is not a formula. It's a human interaction with karma, destiny, so that sometimes you can see that the spiritual world intervenes and doesn't follow their, what you would call standard rules, but that they create unions of different beings in one human personality for just one incarnation. And so these kind of beings they're a revelation, they're an inspiration, they're a wonder. And he also explains when a master knows that a master has become a master, and what are the earmarks? When does this happen? How does it happen? And so on and so forth. So if you want to understand masters, saying Rudolf Steiner and the masters in a title is bold, because we can't possibly address all the concepts that Rudolf Steiner brings forth in relationship to this. But at the same time, we can point towards the wonder, awe, and reverence that one will arrive at if you understand the nature of the teachings of Rudolf Steiner on the masters.
Yes, you only need to consider the way Rudolf Steiner, one day Marie Steiner, his wife, Marie von Sievers, she walked into the living room the place where they were living, and Rudolf Steiner was there, and he looked stunned. And she said, Rudolf, what's wrong? He said, he pointed at a chair and he said, Master Christian Rosenkreuz was here sitting in that chair. I mean, it moved him so profoundly that he was basically stunned, because, again, Christian Rosenkreuz was somebody who he was in touch with super sensibly, that he could communicate with these high beings anytime he wanted to. But to have them actually show up in a physical body was not the usual state of affairs. And he had a developed relationship with the Master Zarathustra, who was teaching in the Carpathian Mountains, and that is the being that he refers to as M in his autobiography. Now, there's other people that disagree with me on that, and it's like, okay, fine. That doesn't matter because I've done the work. And the place where they say this other being that was supposed to be that being, that's a couple thousand miles away. And so it gets very, very confused as you try to pursue these things, as I have over the last 50 years or so. But so it's important to realize the mood of soul that one needs to bring in order to be able to enter into a relationship with such highly developed beings, that the humility and the acceptance of grace is such an important thing. Like they say, you wash your scrape off your feet before you walk into a sacred place. Wash your hands before you pray. That there are certain gestures of reverence that are actually very, very potent, and they seem to understand that much better in the Orthodox conversion. That in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they have very much participated with that type of realm through all the icons, but it's a very much an emotive thing, that it's something that's happening on the level of feeling, that they're not really attempting to work their way into it on an intellectual level of understanding. Whereas in the West, what do we have? We have like a legalistic doctrinal approach, and the balancing act between those two that was worked out in the 9th century by Pope Nicholas I is quite fascinating. And so you can enter into these things, and as you go deeper and deeper, it's more and more rewarding as you begin to unravel this great mosaic of human destiny. And you start to look at some of the attainments of great master beings in the past. I mean, you can look at, just on the level of architecture, you can look and see, like the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's like, I don't know about you, but I don't know any corporation in the world today that could build the Great Pyramid. So, I mean, what is that? And you go to all the other megalithic places, and you see these massively huge tonnage cut down to levels of tolerance, and they're supposedly using like copper tools. And so it behooves you to be very, very circumspect when you come to conclusions regarding these things. Mind you, it's a good thing to study it, but it's not a good thing if you just go off half developed in your understanding, that you want to believe that you figured it out. Because trust me, I've been at it a long, long time, and you're going to surprise yourself at almost every turn. Is that when you get to, just when you think you got to the deep level, then it begins to unfold again, and you're once again humbled. So I guess just try to stay humble, and I think you'll make greater progress.
That's right. And when the chela is ready, the masters will appear. And that happens, it really does. It's happened to me a number of times. And I can tell you that literally afterwards, you just feel like you're a worm, and that you have so much advancement to make before you can actually have a conversation with one of these beings. But you mentioned Steiner and making reference to M, which stands for master. All these reports are usually between Steiner and one person. And so we get these reports, and so we put them in the book, and you can make your own decision about it. But basically, John and I have gone to every Vorstan member that in the old days and said, here's our list of questions. And top of the question was the M, the person that Felix Kagutsky, the herb gatherer, introduced Steiner to in the Carpathian Mountains? Which of the masters was that? Was that as you called him, and that's a good way to look at it, Master Zarathustra, who became Master Jesus? Or was it Christian Rosenkreutz, Lazarus raised, who became John the Beloved, and numerous other incarnations? And so we'd ask them, and by golly, I'd get a different answer from everybody, and they were certain that they were right. And then they'd say why so and so in this book is wrong, and why so and so, and why Elizabeth Verdee's wrong, why Wegman's wrong, why all. So you're left holding the bag. And so you try to study this because you can find these references, even if you're not a very deep anthroposophist. And nowadays they're talked about like it's popcorn at the movie. So what happened? In the end, because my teacher, Werner Glass and Rene Corrido, and these really incredible beings that I got to spend time with, Hagen Vassants and Carlo Piesner, beings, a few of whom literally you could put right up there in the realm of, yeah, they're on their way to being a master. And why? Because they had tremendous humility, as John just pointed out, tremendous compassion, and their power to speak was so profound, and they used simple words that everyone understood what they said. And all your questions dissolve in front of them. I love that. Whenever you're with one of these beings and you go with a whole list of questions, you better have it written down, because in their presence, their resonance will make your brain go smooth, because your silly questions don't really mean anything in the long run. They're working in the absolute, you're working in the relative realm. So down here in the physical realm, you're asking silly questions and they're looking at you from the spiritual world, just smiling. So what did we have to do in the old days? Go ahead, John.
Well, yeah, it's like we used to bring David Spangler into town numerous times, and also Milenko Matanovic, which doesn't get mentioned that often, but he was an initiate, no question about that. But I can remember we'd bring in David, and I'd think of all these questions that I was going to ask him, and by the time he'd get here, then I go sit down next to him, and it was like, "Hi, David, how you doing?" It's like I'd either solve the question on the way to him arriving, or it just seemed kind of silly, And again, I've spoke to this on numerous occasions, but it's often been the case that I'd be with leading anthroposophists and I'd ask them a question, and they would just look at me. They didn't even respond to the question. Of course, I would solve it in my own time through my own efforts. And so the method of the future is the method of the individual finding their way. It's not a path of guru devotion. Although if that's their path for them, if they feel that that's what they're comfortable with, well, by all means, go ahead. But really, in the past of Earth evolution, the clairvoyant capacities that mankind had was something that was a gift to the spiritual world, that it was something that was fostered onto us, and it wasn't something that came out of our own personal development. Although there were centers of initiation where individuals would be selected to be able to study and go through the initiation rites that would bring them to a higher stage of development than the rest of the people that were already clairvoyant, but not to the extent or level of understanding of these initiates. But now that we've moved past the turning point of time and the incarnation of the greatest of the avatars, the Christ that incarnated into Jesus Nazareth at the baptism in the River Jordan and lived within the Jesus vehicles for a period of around 3 years, that this great being came to Earth for our sake to save Earth evolution from mankind, because one thing we're perfectly adept at is getting it wrong. And so thankfully he showed up. But in the meantime, there was a shift in the nature of the path of development for mankind through this bringing to mankind the I am by Christ. And so consequently, now as we move into the future, increasingly so, it's dependent on your personal efforts to be able to reach to these exalted levels of being, that you can't just expect it to passively happen to you. Those people that do not take up the task will not get the same result as those that do. And so, and you're perfectly free to participate or not. And so you end up with a whole potpourri of outcomes, really. And so where are you going? It's just like in Through the Looking Glass, that Alice finds the Cheshire Cat, and she says, "Well, where do I go?" And he says, "Well, where do you want to get to?" And she says, "Well, I don't really know." And he says, "Well, then it really doesn't matter, does it?" It may have been the hookah smoking caterpillar. I can't remember. Either that or
it's hard to remember these things. But yeah, when David Spangler, you'd ask him a question, he'd go into the realm of the angels, and you'd watch him talk to the angels. And then pretty soon you forgot your question because the presence of the angels came in. What are you going to do then? Oh, really? You're going to ask a stupid question about the master beings? Or does Master El Moria really exist? I want to know. No, that's not what happens. What happens is the exposure to these things causes your own self-development. Now, with Rudolf Steiner, in the old days, when people would talk about who was Rudolf Steiner, that you had to whisper it. And basically you were chastised for even thinking the thought. And if you wanted to ask the thought, then you're really going to get in trouble with the old Theosophists, because first off, they didn't know the answer. Second off, it was sacred ground and you weren't supposed to go there. So one day I'm riding along with Werner and I say, "Werner, what is this they say that Rudolf Steiner is Aristotle reincarnated?" And he's like, "Douglas." And then I take him in the house and he comes out with this book called Rudolf Steiner's Mission and Ida Wegman. And he goes, "I'm going to loan you this book, Douglas, just for tonight. You must return it to me tomorrow when you pick me up. And you must tell no one that I let you read it." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" I found out later that it's a numbered edition. You had to be a member of the first class, and then you had to be special, or you weren't going to get this book. So I took it home, I read it, and what is it? Here are verses that Rudolf Steiner gave to Ida Wegman, who worked with him very closely towards the end of his life, his doctor, as a matter of fact. And basically they're verses that she had been given by Steiner that were super top secret, that were hers. And Marguerite Kircher, or whatever her name is, her assistant, took them after Edith Wegman's death and put them in this book. Well, clearly that is an awful violation. But had you looked in Steiner's work, you'll find the same thing, but not so clear. So Steiner said, here's a meditation to realize, Ida Wegman, that you are Gilgamesh reincarnated, and I am the hairy man with horns, Enkidu or Ibani. And you're like, okay, if you're going to say that you were somebody incarnated, that is not who you would choose, okay? I was the wild man that Gilgamesh wrestled with, that no one could tame, and that the story of
the hairy
wild man, okay? And you go, that's not really, like when Anna Besant said, here's my last 24 incarnations or whatever it was. She was every great woman that ever was. Yeah, no, that isn't what Steiner did. So here's Ida saying, you're telling me I was Gilgamesh? And that's the reason she was obsessed with finding the tree of life or the tree of immortality. That's the reason she was a doctor and she did all that she did. That was her striving. She was Gilgamesh. And then he gave her a verse to wake her up to the fact that during the burning of Ephesus, and this is in his lectures, that Alexander was born, and that Alexander was the student of Aristotle. Oh, well, Ida, you were Alexander, and I was Aristotle, Steiner said to her.
Now, keep in mind, Rudolf Steiner did numerous lectures regarding the incarnations of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. But he never said he was talking about himself and about Ida Wegman and that whole connection. That was something that he kept very close to the vest. That was a private thing that he shared with her. And so you have to keep that in mind. But it's fascinating, the work that he does. And when you look at the centrality of Aristotle within the thought as it led into the age of the intellectual soul, and then you end up with the transformation of Aristotle and reincarnating as St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Thomas's assistant, Reginald of Piperno, who was really the only one that could read the minuscule, crabbed handwriting of Thomas Aquinas and be able to take his work and transport him into a form that was readable for other people. And so you look at this whole series of incarnations, and it's really, you have to keep in mind that Rudolf Steiner's personal mission had to do with the reintroduction of the concepts of reincarnation and karma within the Christian stream. But he couldn't get to it until really focused at the end of his life, because he was so busy completing the accomplishments that should have been done by others that were incapable of accomplishing them. So that's a very, very important point. And so you have the Karmic Relationship 8-volume series that's available out there is a masterwork. And don't believe it. Don't take him as an authority. Live with these things. See if it proves true for you. See if they have value in your own spiritual path. That's the way to approach it. He said, all I expect from people is a temporary, how did he put it? A temporary cessation of disbelief.
Yes, and when you're going to start writing or you start imagining your own reincarnations and you're always some glorious king or queen, well, take a look at Steiner's. He was then, after that, he was Critolus, the philosopher at Ephesus, and Ida Wegman was one of his students. And then he was or before that, he was like a philosopher of Heraclitus. And then later he was in the Grail legends. But was he the Grail king? Was he Parsifal? No, he was the young man no one ever even notices, Shian Terlander, who's been killed for the sake of Parsifal. So it's a bad incarnation, you'd say. That's not a master.
Aurelius ends up killing Shionatalander because he's coming after Parsifal, and so in his stead, Shionatalander ends up getting killed. And so Rudolf Steiner did comment that he didn't get to meet Parsifal, that he had never met Parsifal in a physical incarnation, because he died as a result of the knight Aurelius. And so Parsifal encounters Shionatalander, and he's deceased in the lap of Sigun, Parsifal's cousin. And of course, who is Sigun? But Ida Wegman.
Yes, and basically what you have there is an example of the greatest suffering one can have and still have love that goes from life to life. And so these two, Ida Wegman and Rudolf Steiner, are not your classic Summit Lighthouse masters and mistresses, or whatever you call a female master. That was supposed to be a joke. Females are also called masters. So the point is that then when he was Aristotle and his assistant, as John described, Reginald, he had he utilized the perfected astral body of Christ. Well, it's well known. The histories all say the same. They had to stop the doctor of angels, or the angelic doctor, Thomas Aquinas, from saying mass because he would levitate, and Reginald would have to go over and grab him by the feet and pull him to the ground, and he'd take 3 hours to say mass, and he'd levitate during it because he really had the real experience, right? Well, that's who Rudolf Steiner was. Now let's remember, Aristotle has become the evil of modern science. Rudolf Steiner has been turned into its opposite in these days. They now call Steiner a Nazi and a fascist and a misogynist and this, the opposite of what he is. So though he was in fact a master being of some sort, look at the bad rap he gets. So when you get to see these masters from the East who, all have long hair and beards and they have these wonderful things to say, that's all well and good. That's the past. The real issue is, if you want to be like Christian Rosenkreutz, you have 10 martyr incarnations. You suffer more than anyone can possibly imagine, and your work is taken and turned into the opposite 100 years after you die. Rudolf Steiner pointed this out. So nowadays, Steiner says you have to be a church of one. You have to have your own North Star. You have to have your own religion. You have to have your own self-initiatory process where you don't need the masters. And if you do need the guru devotion, as John pointed out before, which is also in this book, a whole description of it and the psychological disturbances that arise from that, if you remember this, in the past, when you looked for a guru in the far past, you looked at all of them. There are thousands of them, and you chose one. And you get to really give them a hard time at first, asking them all the most difficult questions. And then after that, you don't get to ask any more questions. You simply look at their life and their art of life and their mastership, and you emulate it. And the more that you do not look at the negative part of that human being, the higher they become in your own perception of them as a master. In other words, you make the master a master. And the more students a master has, the more that energy goes to them, and it's called guru worship, guru devotion. And it is very clear that you do not necessarily find a master being who is ascended, as they call it nowadays, ascended masters. No, you're finding a human being who's taken the vow of the bodhicitta, which is, I seek enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, and I will not go to heaven until I have I've given a hand to everyone else trying to get into heaven. And that's what Kuan Yin says. That's the reason they show Kuan Yin with the dragon. Kuan Yin doesn't go into the gates of heaven, though she deserves it, until she has tamed everything and helped everyone else get into heaven. And even the dragon itself, she has tamed with her blessed drops of sacredness in the vase, and she gives it to the dragon. And then even the dragon is redeemed. Even Lucifer and Ahriman, Satan, are all redeemed by the vow of the bodhicitta. So if you have that vow, you are on the path of mastership. It's as simple as that. If you don't have a path of spiritual initiation, my beautiful wife, Tyla, Gabriel has written this beautiful book called The Gospel Sophia, which is a anthroposophic way to have self-initiation, that you can do it yourself, because unfortunately it's going to come down to you having to do it yourself. Or if you take our series from the works of Rudolf Steiner's, we've tried to answer all these questions that people come with when they say, I'm looking for a guru, I'm looking for the master. Here are my questions. What's life after death? What are angels? What are the hierarchies? What are this? What was that? Well, Steiner's kind of difficult to get through. So we try to synthesize it for you and give it to you in a fashion that you yourself become what Steiner describes here. Because here's what he points out. Not only the realm of spiritual economy that we've talked about, but he talks about the superhuman beings who are here from Venus, Vulcan, and Mercury to help us right now. And he says, from a picture of Earth evolution in the future. So now Vulcan beings are actually coming into the realm of earthly existence. Super earthly beings are already here. And the fact that we are able to have a connected body of spiritual science at all today is due to the circumstances that beings from beyond the earth are bringing the messages from the spiritual world down into earth existence. The beings I've spoken about will descend gradually to earth. Vulcan beings, Vulcan superhumans, Venus superhumans, Mercury superhumans, Sun superhumans, and so on will unite themselves with earth existence. And so there's a plethora of spiritual beings that might even be called masters, who are spiritual beings descending and spiritual beings ascending, who are willing to help us. But in the bottom line, at the gates of spiritual science, Steiner summarizes it beautiful, and he says, That which is here called the masters is the divine voice which speaks in us. It speaks constantly, but we do not allow always for it to emerge. The thought form of love is open, hence the voice of the masters can sound through it. But the closed thought form of hate leaves the divine thought form no way out, so that it has to remain unheard. So seek the voice of love, seek the voice of the masters.
As it says in Scripture, when they asked of Jesus, how shall we know the Christians? He said, you shall know them by their deeds.